Uh, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Um, my name is Chris Lamb. I am uh, a second-year grad student in the astronomy department at University of Florida. That's the first time I've ever introduced myself as such. Um, and I'm also one of the co-founders and co-executive directors of Align, the Alliance for the Low Income and First Generation Narrative. We're an annual national conference formed by first generation low income, or FGLI, students. Um, and we've been doing this since 2017. If you're interested in being involved, either organizing the conference, attending conference, helping out in any way, feel free to reach out to me after the event. I'm here with my co-host for this event, Josh. So yeah, Josh, take it away and introduce our panelists for us.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see all of your beautiful and electronic faces. It's been a while since I've seen some in-person faces, but this is the best we can do for now. So for all of those that you don't know me, my name is Josh Ferris. I am a graduate of the University of Virginia. And for those of you that are involved in TRIO out there, as we have a large proportion of those here today, I am both a participant of Upward Bound and Talent Search when I was younger. I also worked for 2 Upward Bound programs and a Talent Search program, so I'm very familiar with the space. I'm great to see everybody here today. We had a lot of interest in this event, way more than our last 2 events. This is a part 3 of our final series of summer speaker series on first generation low income issues. Our first 2 we had this past summer, and so those were focused on more in the workforce. Today, we're focusing on more of the experience of both transitioning into grad school or the experience of being in grad school as a first generation and or low income student. What the current research says is that a lot of students, when they do graduate, if they do graduate, because we acknowledge a lot of peers that we had that did not finish, that they often tend not to go to grad school because it's, 1, it's expensive, and 2, we might not know a lot about that experience. It's different. And so we thought we would have this event today for that reason. And so half of you that have registered are identify as both first generation and low income. Half of you identify as current graduate students. The remainder are either high school students, college students, or those that work with these students. And so we welcome everybody, even if you don't identify with the first generation or low income. And so today, I think we're going to have 45 minutes for the panelists to talk about their experience transitioning into grad school as well as through grad school. And then we're going to break out into breakout sessions, and you can choose which one of the 4 you would most identify with and would like to go into the breakout rooms with. At the end, for those of you that stay, I have a few resources. So 1, I have a list of 1,000 fully funded programs. If you're interested in any, it's a master's or PhD or dual degree program. So over 1,000 free across the country. Number 2 is I acknowledge we don't have someone here to talk about law school today, but I did write a law school curriculum for those of you specifically for first generation students, if you're interested in that. So I'll be passing that out, as well as I have a link to a nonprofit that especially works with first generation and underrepresented minorities and helping them equip them for grad school, getting through grad school, and transitioning successfully out of grad school. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our lovely panelists today. Our first panelist is Haylle Reidy. I hope I pronounced that right. Haylle is a product manager for a Series A healthcare startup in New York City. She's passionate about using technology to improve health outcomes, particularly for underserved populations. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts from Wesleyan University and recently graduated from Dartmouth College with a joint MBA and MPH program. Haylle, can you just do a flag on yours to see who you are? Next, we have Dr. Lisette Sanchez, one of my personal favorites. Dr. Lisette is a bilingual and bicultural licensed psychologist. She works full-time at a university counseling center. She also founded the Calathea Wellness, which is a virtual practice providing individual therapy, coaching, and mentoring services. Then we have Jorge Cortes, who earned his BS in mechanical engineering from UC Berkeley, as well as an MS in aerospace engineering from San Jose State University. After working as a satellite controller, Jorge returned to academia to pursue astronomy. He's a fourth-year graduate student in the Department of Astronomy at Columbia. And then finally, we have Dr. Rosa Yu, who is a resident physician at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and a clinical fellow at Harvard Medical School. She earned her MD from Stanford University and completed her undergraduate studies in neuroscience at Brown University. Her mission is to improve the quality and accessibility of care for underserved communities. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right into the first question for our panelists. And so panelists, as our first question, if you could just tell us a bit about yourself, introduce yourselves to us, as well as what made you decide to pursue graduate school. So whoever wants to speak first.
I can go first. It's tough when you're not in person. So Josh, thanks so much for the introduction. I guess some things that are like more true to where I come from. I think in order to know who I am, I have to talk a little bit about my parents. So my parents immigrated from rural China before I was born, and so I was born in New York City, which is where I grew up. We grew up in Brooklyn, and as I was when I was little, you know, my mom worked at a nearby factory, and my dad worked a number of sort of blue collar jobs. Neither of them spoke very much. Actually, my mom still doesn't really speak English, and my dad speaks very minimal English. The highest level of education that my mom got was junior high school because she's one of the oldest of 7 kids, and so her job was always to take care of her younger siblings. My dad is also from a big family, and he went through high school without sort of the extent of it as well. And so despite this, they really valued education, and I think there's a whole lot of luck and a lot of other things that are out of my control that led me to be able to get to where I am today. And I think it's easy to say that it feels like I'm living the American dream, but I think it's also really faulty to think of it that way, because there are many people that I went to high school with who never graduated, who, you know, are doing very different things and never had access to the opportunities that I had. Growing up, we didn't have a whole lot of money, and so I wasn't sure that I was gonna go to college until I was able to get into a program that basically allowed me to go for free, and that was a huge privilege. And similarly for med school, I was really worried about the debt that people accrue when they go to med school, because that was not something that we ever, you know, I've never been taught to manage. And I think not coming from money, it's really scary to owe hundreds of thousands of dollars to other people. And so I was very lucky to go to Stanford, where I actually got really generous scholarships and graduated with pretty minimal debt. And so this process of going to medical school was something that I kind of knew as a little kid, but I don't think I really knew what that entailed because I didn't know a single doctor except for the ones that I saw. And I think there's no way to know what medicine is until you're actually doing it. That said, I'm really thankful to be doing what I do. And I think my mission is not only to help the health of underserved communities, but mostly communities like my own. I think there are very few people who come from communities like mine in the hospital. And I think even just being in the hospital, having had the experience that I've had, it allows me to provide better patient care. And also it's allowed me to help heal my own communities, which has been really healing for myself, especially through the pandemic. I feel like for the people that I know growing up, just to know a doctor or two can be life-saving. So it's been a really great experience. And so if anyone wants to hear more about any of those things, whether here or at another point, just reach out.
Thank you for that, Rosa. So I'm sure anyone else had anything to add, or other panelists, on introducing yourself, and if you have a similar experience or that experience differs, well, what would you say?
I can go ahead and go next. So actually, that resonated with me quite a bit. So very similar to Rosa, I am a first-generation American and first-generation college graduate. So very similar. My family, my parents immigrated to the United States from Michoacan, Mexico, and settled here in California. So growing up, I always knew that education was important because they had emphasized the importance of it. But it wasn't really until I kind of walked that journey or traversed that journey that I kind of figured out why it was that I was doing what I had chosen to do. that sounds kind of silly, I guess, but I had kind of chosen to go the doctorate route before I even knew what that meant, just because of the importance that my parents had put on an education. So growing up, I always strived to do very well academically and be able to I guess get to a point where I would be able to give back in a sense to them. So I had a very sort of winding road to the point of being in graduate school for astronomy at Columbia. So I went to undergrad for engineering because I wanted to do something that had a very positive job outlook. So even though I had always been very much interested in astronomy, somewhere along the way, I decided that engineering would be better because that would allow me to have a job right out of college and be able to provide for myself and potentially be able to give some help to my parents financially. And so it was kind of a bit of a journey to really sort of discover what it was that I was passionate about. And long story short, I guess there was a lot of sort of convincing that I had to do for myself in terms of choosing to go the astronomy route. And ultimately what I settled upon was that that was a way that I could honor the sacrifices that my parents did by doing something that I was passionate about, even though it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be making big bucks. To me, doing something that I was passionate about was a way to sort of honor the sacrifices that they had done. So with that said, though, I still was very careful with the route that I took in order to not put myself in a lot of debt. And so I could expand on that during my breakout session if any of you are interested in that.
Thanks, Jorge. So we've obviously seen a couple commonalities, and one is that sense of wanting to provide for family or for community, increased earnings or instability with a bachelor's degree. So would any of the other two panelists like to chime in on their experiences and why they chose to go to grad school?
I want to say that I really resonate with both of the things that the other panelists have shared in terms of talking about, wanting to get back to family, trying to figure out that path. And so, and similar to Rosa, when she shared about how important it is to share a little bit about my family background and how much that really has shaped who I am, my values, what's important to me, why I wanted to even be on this panel, right? It's so important. It's so important to see representation. It's so important to see these people working so hard. And going through graduate school is an incredibly challenging experience and unlike anything that I have anticipated. And I see you all nodding. It's so hard. It is so much harder than I ever thought it would be. And so I do a lot of mentorship because of it to try to normalize that and also just provide support and access to resources, because when you're first gen, it's so hard to find allies on campus at times. And when you think you have found an ally, sometimes it's not the best person. It's not the actual mentor that you needed. And so I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in North Hollywood, for those of you who are on the West Coast. So I have anyone on the West Coast here? Hello, you're from the West Coast. Awesome. And so I grew up with immigrant parents. So my parents are from Mexico and El Salvador, and also working class. And they also had very limited education. They grew up in really rural areas in their home countries. And so coming here, they understood the value of education, and they wanted me to do it, but they didn't really understand what that meant in terms of what my journey would take me away from them. And so I'm the oldest. There's only two of us in terms of myself and my brother. And of the two of us, since I'm the oldest, I'm oldest female. And being an oldest female in the Latinx household, there's a lot of responsibilities and expectations. And so my family had this idea that what going to college meant was I'd go to a community college, and maybe when I was 25, I would get married and move out of the house. And that was their idea of this is success. This is what my daughter's going to do. I'm going to be very happy for her. So when I turned 18 and I was like, oh, I'm going to go to college and I'm moving, they were very upset by that. And I always like to share that with folks because we normally like to normalize that sometimes parents don't have the best response, don't have the supportive reaction that you want in that moment. And I remember my first year in college, my grandmother was calling me and she was yelling at me. She was telling me, Lisette, you've left home, your mother is sick, and it's all your fault. And I remember sitting that as a first gen, you're just trying to adjust to college. You're just trying to figure out your classes. You're just trying, like, what am I supposed to do next? And I'm getting these phone calls guilting me for leaving home when I'm just trying to advance my education, trying to figure that out. And so while again, their heart was in the best place where they wanted me to have an education, they had a really hard time letting go of what that looked like for me. And that eventually transitioned. They learned how to support me. They understood that I didn't just leave home to run away from them, that I left home because I wanted to pursue a higher education, because I was interested in this career path. This is what I wanted to do. And something that I'll add, so I'm a licensed psychologist. I wanted to be a licensed psychologist since I was in 7th grade, but I had no idea what that actually meant. In my mind, I thought being a licensed psychologist, I would go to undergrad, I'd get my bachelor's, I'd be a psychologist, like wonderful 4 years. I showed up in my first quarter, I was at my undergrad, I did my undergrad at UC San Diego, 2 hours away from home. My parents were so angry. That was 2 hours away from home, but UC San Diego, and there was a seminar, and the seminar was careers in psychology. I'm like, wonderful, this way I can learn about what the next steps are. And that is where I learned that you needed a PhD to become a psychologist. That's when I learned that I needed like a minimum 3.0 GPA to apply to graduate school and even begin that process. And that transition to undergrad, I struggled a lot with academics my very first quarter. I was 4.0 student, my first quarter GPA was 2.6. And I remember I was so upset by it, but I was working so hard. And I was like, what's happening? I'm so used to being so high achieving, but I wasn't considering all of the mental health challenges that I was experiencing during my transition, just general adjustment, all of the struggles that come with being a first gen student. And especially when you're coming from a low income background, right? Like not being able to go home certain times because it's hard to afford even the train ride home, right? And trying to navigate what that looks like. And so all of these experiences really helped me they helped with a lot of things, but one of the reasons I specialize in working with first gen students and first gen professionals is because of my life expertise around it, right? We have this lived expertise. And I always like to remind folks of that when you're first gen, the immigrant experience, wherever you are when it comes to these firsts, this gives you this lived expertise, and it's so wonderful. And it's so important to share that with others in the way that you are able to give. And so that's why I'm here with you all today. And I'm going to pause because I can talk a lot. So I'm going to check myself for a minute, but so happy to be with you all. I'm happy to answer any questions about that path that I took. It's just a little bit different. And again, I'm so happy to share the space with all these amazing humans. And so thank you all for taking the time to invest in yourself by being here with us. And also to the panelists, for also dedicating time to do this, because I know I'm busy. I imagine you're all super busy. And so this is a real treat. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you. That was great, sharing a lot about your experience, about the turmoils you had even before deciding to go to school, which is a big factor. And imagine a lot of students here are still deciding if they want to go to grad school, so that's informative. I think, Haylle, do you have anything you'd like to add about just introducing yourself and your own experience about wanting to go to grad school and why?
Yeah, thanks, Josh, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight and for the other panelists. I don't have too much to add because everyone has made such really wonderful points, but just a little bit about me. So I grew up in Connecticut, a very working class family, and interestingly, my family really did not prioritize education. My parents really did not think of it as something to strive for. And so a lot of the challenges that I faced in navigating undergrad and then in my decision-making process around pursuing grad school was really is this something that my parents are going to support? Will they understand why I'm making these decisions? And so ultimately they were very supportive of me, but I felt at times like very lost and very alone when I was navigating these decisions and these processes. And in particular, so after undergrad, I worked for a couple of years and then decided to go to business school. And for those of you that are interested in business school, we can talk a lot more about it in a breakout session, but business school is very wrapped up in some of these like very high wealth circles. And there is a lot of like sense that really only wealthy people can afford to go to business school. And so I did not have really like friends or family members that I could lean on in support of my application process. And so I would definitely encourage people, if you're interested, to like chat with me about it, because I think there is like a misconception. And I think business school can be a really wonderful opportunity for folks, especially if you are interested in working in the business sector, but trying to do so in a more intentional way. I think there's like a huge opportunity for more people that are thoughtful around the business sector. So anyway, I'm so happy to be here and look forward to chatting with more of you.
That's awesome. So thank you to all your panelists for sharing a little bit about your experiences and what made you decide you wanted to go to grad school. So this next question, the next few questions we have for you, feel free to answer as you see feels fit to you. We will talk until about 7:45, and then we'll transition to breaking rooms, so wherever we get at right then. So we want to have more time for everybody to have one-on-one or more intimate conversations with the panelists. So our next question is more about, if you feel so to share, to tell us about a challenge you faced transitioning into grad school, a little bit more in depth, and how you went about it, how you faced it or resolved that challenge you had when transitioning into grad school. Because arguably that is one of the harder experiences, is that just making that first step about how do you, what to expect when you even start that process.
I can share a really really kind of succinct example, but one of the things that I was extremely taken aback by and struck by when I started at business school was how many of my peers were like completely financially supported by their families. And so this came up in conversations around like, what are you doing on weekends? And oh, like a whole group of my friends are going off to Montreal on some, fancy trip. And it was kind of a shock initially just to hear that people in grad school where you're not making any money and you're only relying on what savings you might have and you're going into debt, were able to afford all these like fancy trips and all these like extras. And so it was, I had like really intense, FOMO. Like I obviously wanted to do these things, but I had to be realistic about my situation and get really comfortable saying no, but also getting comfortable proposing when I wanted to hang out with a friend, like, let's go for a walk, let's go for a hike, let's think about how we can spend time in a way that doesn't center around just spending money that we don't have during grad school.
Yeah, Haylle, that makes me think about an experience I had. When you go to med school, there's something called the white coat ceremony. And basically what that entails is day one of med school, they give you a white coat and that's what you wear throughout your clinical rotations. I thought you got it when you became a doctor, but you get it right when you get there. And so my parents flew out to California, which is where I did med school, and they were so stoked. Like they have no idea what's going on, but they're like, hors d'oeuvres, things are free. So they're so excited. I'm super stressed because I'm like always worried about them and about them feeling comfortable, but they're so proud that they're not thinking about any of this at all. It was really interesting because when I got to the white coat ceremony, a lot of people's parents had white coats. And so my parents were like, oh, do we get them too? Like, is that how this works? And it just turned out that like most of the people that I went to med school with came from 2-doctor families. And I was like, no, like that's not really how it works. But one of the proudest things for me was giving my white coat to them to wear. And they were just like spinning around and they were just really relishing it because it was a coat that was for all of us. And so I think med school is so hard, and the pressure is so immense. And Lisette's mentioned the mental health challenges that come with it, and they can be really crushing when you're managing yourself, but also thinking about the stresses at home. I had a lot of close friends who are also first-time low income, some of whom are undocumented, and so they were dealing with that stress as they're going through med school, and that other people in the room are not dealing with any of those things. Like they're just stressed about med school. They don't have to worry about their family, how they're managing. And so I think the thing that helps me in those circumstances is trying to step back and remember the journey traveled. Like, it's wild to me that I can even be a doctor considering where my family came from. Like, that is, if I just sit with that a little bit, I can sort of relieve some of the pressure that I've put on myself. And I think that that's what sustains me. And I think the people's lives that I'm able to change at work is an incredible, incredible privilege. And that's something that fulfills something that like nothing monetarily ever will. So it's hard to explain, and it's not every day that you can sort of maintain that positive outlook, but it's incredibly satisfying.
I love that comment, Rosa, because especially if you're working with a lot of low-income clients, you're working with those that might have been, you have that experience with, and you have that empathy when talking about their issues. And it's even bigger, maybe your peers didn't have that kind of approach because they didn't have that experience growing up. So I love the journey traveled kind of comment and metaphor. Does anyone else want to comment on a challenge they faced transitioning into grad school, or something that was an obstacle that they tried to overcome?
Yeah, I can kind of expand on something that I mentioned during my intro. So one of the biggest challenges that I faced, I want to say, was the justification, not necessarily to my parents or family, but more so to me, about pursuing graduate school, and not even just graduate school, but I guess specifically graduate school in astronomy, coming from an engineering undergrad and master's program. So the way that I looked at it, it was kind of, I don't want to say it was silly, but it was, I at the time, I definitely felt selfish pursuing, or at least trying to get into an astronomy graduate program, just because it didn't necessarily mean that I was going to be earning more than I was after a master's degree, especially since I was transitioning into another field. So justifying I guess the effort that it would take to do this degree and not necessarily have a higher paycheck was kind of wild, just because like I said, it felt selfish. I wasn't necessarily going into a field where it was going to kind of revolutionize or maybe like provide help to a lot of people. It was more so just for my own satisfaction that I was going to be thinking about different types of astronomical objects. I think one of the things that ended up really helping me was, and I think Rosa, you mentioned this, kind of taking a step back and looking at the journey that you had traversed, and just kind of being able to see that you actually had this amazing privilege of being able to pursue something that you were incredibly passionate about. So historically, astronomy has been something that only like a very select few wealthy individuals are able to do. And I think it's important to kind of tear that down and have much more representation. And so to me, that was kind of like one of the challenges is coming to terms with being okay with going into a field that didn't necessarily have an immediate impact in your surroundings, but maybe it has a much more broader impact in the long run. And I mean, I think being in a position to kind of pursue a passion is incredible, and I definitely see that as an amazing privilege, and so that's kind of one of the challenges that I faced.
Ooh, you hit me, because the research often shows that there's a moral dilemma that first generation students often face, is pursuing something that they're passionate about versus pursuing something that is lucrative and provides stable earnings, not just to provide for themselves, but for their families and their communities. And sometimes they clash, and it's hard for them to dissolve those dilemmas. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, Jorge. Any other comments before we move on to the next question?
I'd like to share something just about the experience of, transitioning into graduate school and the challenges around that. Going to graduate school was the first time that I moved out of state, and I lived, so I grew up in California. I went to my master's program in New York, and I remember how hard it was to be that far away from my family for the first time, especially when you don't have as many resources, right? So like I spent most of my time in New York. I spent the holidays in New York. I remember my first Thanksgiving away, like my family, like they wanted me to feel like I was there. And so they thought it would be sweet to pass the phone around to everyone so they could all say why they're thankful for me. And I was just fighting back tears the whole time because I was missing them so much, but I wanted to be strong for them because I'm like, I'm away and, you know, I'm doing all these good things and I want them to be happy. But yeah, that adjustment of being away, and you'll see a theme. I always highlight all the mental health because I'm so passionate about it. But yeah, that just being away, not having that immediate support, that community that you have in certain spaces. Because even when I was here in California, like even it was 2 hours, I knew I still had access and it felt easier. When the first time out of state, that adjustment. And some of you maybe experienced that for undergrad, but for me, that was a really big challenge, and then finding that community. And so I learned that. Then when I moved to Oregon for my doctoral program, it was, okay, the first thing I did was, how do I find my community? Not necessarily my peers. It's not about the colleagues, like, where do I feel that I belong in this space? Where is my, the space where I feel safe, you know? And so really thinking about what that looks like for you, because for me, community has been everything. Community is what keeps me going, and specifically community outside of my academic department. That's where I sought that support, and that's what I found was really helpful.
Thank you, everyone, for your answers to that second question. I'll comment before moving on to the third question that Jorge's answer caused me, like the first half of it made me want to quit astronomy, and the second half of it made me want to stay forever. So the third question is this. I think we lucked out that our panelists' trajectory sort of just shook out like this, but two of you, if I'm reading your LinkedIn's correctly, went straight from undergrad to grad school, and two of you went straight from undergrad to work, and then went to grad school later. So I think Jorge and Haylle, you did the latter path. You went to work after graduating from undergrad, and then Lisette and Rosa, you went straight to grad school. And so, you know, originally I was thinking about making it a debate, but I feel like that's just drama for drama's sake. So instead, I'll just couch it in this less dramatic question, which is, how has that particular facet of your experience affected your grad school experience during grad school, and then also like perhaps your experience after grad school, since 3 out of the 4 of you are out of grad school, and I guess Jorge's master's as well, so can be commented on.
You can go ahead and start if that's cool. So something that I failed to mention is that I had given up on the idea of pursuing a doctorate degree. So in the back of my head, I had always had this very like wild fantasy of pursuing astronomy and doing research, and I didn't quite know what that meant growing up. But somewhere along the way, I kind of gave up on it and was like, okay, well, I'm just going to do engineering. And so what that resulted in was me doing a master's program and then going into industry and working for 2 years. And so I think what that provided me with was a lot of clarity, and it ended up convincing me to go for it. And in addition to that, it also provided me with a nice cushion in terms of financials. So working for 2 years gave me the clarity to convince myself to pursue graduate school and transition into astronomy. And it also kind of gave me some money to work with in terms of being able to move to a different city to kind of chase that dream. So I grew up in California. I went to undergrad and master's program in California. And then when the time came, I ended up moving to New York City without knowing New York City or anyone in it, to chase this, I guess what I thought was a very weird but I also really wanted this dream to come true. So anyways, long story short, the 2 years of working gave me clarity and a nice amount of, or not a nice amount, but some money to be able to make the move to New York City and kind of get things rolling.
So I also worked before going to grad school, and I think what is unique about the program that I did I did a joint business graduate degree and master's of public health. Most MBA programs, most business school programs require you to have some level of work experience. It's actually pretty rare to go into an MBA program right after undergrad. So that's kind of like a cop out of to how to answer this question. But what I'll say is that both the business degree and a master's of public health really doesn't give you any specific credential to like perform a job function, like maybe going to med school or becoming a therapist would. And so because of that, when you're looking for jobs, you're really pitching yourself based on both your degree, but also your prior work experience. And so having a good foundation of experience that you can draw on, even if it's not related to exactly what you want to do, but it's more about kind of the skill sets that you've developed and the type of problems that you like solving. That's really important to have as you think about what is your next career step post grad school. So I think for certain types of programs, having a couple years of work experience set you up for greater future job success. I just started a new job like last week, so I am very fresh from like interviewing, and basically all of my interviews were based on like my past job. Like my education was relevant, but all of the interviews were really about like what I had done in the past. And so having that experience kind of reinforced how having a couple years under your belt can be really beneficial.
I actually did work for a year before med school. Don't worry, Chris, it's pretty much the same thing. It was a strategic decision. I think that was the year that I needed to make some money to apply to med school because it's super expensive. It's probably like, I don't want to scare you. It's like probably like $10,000 to apply. You're like going to like 20 programs, or you have to fly all over the country to interview. It's really a mess, and it really, I think, highlights why this field is so tough to get into. And that's just the initial cost. So working for a year was actually really beneficial. I didn't make a whole lot of money, but actually it was really striking to me because I was working as a research assistant, and it was an entry-level job in Rhode Island. And I was making more than both of my parents had ever made combined. And I was like, wow, like, I think that was the moment when I was like, I have enough, and I think that was really liberating. Where I was like, even if I chose not to go to medical school, like I would easily, my parents were able to provide for us. We always we didn't have luxuries, but we had enough. And so that was really something that I think a lot of my peers never have, even now. And so in that year, I made enough to like apply for med school, pay for my cost of living, and then also travel for 6 weeks, which is always a big dream and not something that we ever really got to do growing up. So it was just a year, but it offered a lot of opportunity, and I think it didn't really set me back in any way. And rather, I think it set me up for greater success later.
I wanted to share a little bit because I guess I am the only one. I did go straight through. I didn't. It's 12 years. I just want to highlight it was 12 years of straight through education. And I'm sure, Jorge, you're currently in the doctoral degree. Like just at one point, I'm like, I just counted at the end. But every year, family's always like, when will you be done? Are you there yet? Like, what's going on? And even when you're done, like for my psychology degree, I had to do a postdoc still. So I'm like, I have this PhD and I'm making 30 grand a year as a postdoc because I need this as the requirement for it. So it's definitely, but the reality was, growing up in a low income family, all of this is still a lot of money to me. All of this, like being able to afford to live on a place for myself, only because the rent was $600 a month in Oregon was that possible. But still, like that made me feel so successful and so great. And so, but I had a very one-track mind. I was like, this is what I'm going to do. And I was so scared that if I stopped and did something else for a year, that it would somehow take me off my path. So that was one of the reasons I kept going was, and also because of the family expectations and obligations. I had so much pressure from my family at the time. They really, and even now, wanted me to settle down, wanted me to start a family, wanted me to get married, because to them, that was also their idea of success. And so I felt all this pressure. And for me, education was always, I'm like, well, I'm still studying. I'm still doing this. This is my priority. I don't have time for these things. And that felt like the easiest way to say, I can't do that. But yeah, just normalize. I was just really scared. I'm like, if I take a year off and go to work, I heard stories of people who didn't go back. Obviously, given our sample, that's not the case. Everyone kept going. But for me, I remember feeling scared. I'm like, no, this is what I have to do. I'm going to figure it out. So that's how it worked. And applying for graduate schools, I should say, I was a McNair scholar. So McNair paid for all of my, McNair covered all of my application fees. That's what made it much more affordable. They paid for my GRE. They paid for everything that was going into applying to graduate school. And then I always had work on campus, like work study and everything. And all of that was also part of what helped fund that application process. And so, yeah, and we didn't have to travel for, I did have to travel. Was it did I travel? Yeah, I was like, by the time I started traveling for interviews, because it was after my master's program, I had access to more scholarships and funds that really helped like manage that. But yeah, it definitely was a lot of prioritizing where I would go and how I would fund it. But airline points also helped a lot. But just trying to think of all the random resources that helped, but all of it, scholarships, airline points, anything, so.
Thank you all for your answers. Speaking of resources, that's a nice segue to our fourth question. It's a mini question because we are going to break out into rooms soon. Josh is setting up the rooms right now. Well, first I do want to address one point that Rosa made that I think Rosa made. Getting that first paycheck from that first job makes it almost like, oh, why should I even go to grad school? Like, this is everything I ever needed in the first place. And I don't know, it took a little bit more, I guess it added a little bit more onto the cons list in my do I go to grad school or not decision-making template. And yeah, I guess that's just something that I struggle with and maybe continue to struggle with now that even though I'm in grad school. But yeah, so resources, we don't really have much time to talk about it. So any resources that any of you four have, in relation to your specific fields, feel free to email that to Josh and I, and we can compile that into a document we'll send to everybody after this event. But does anything like in particular stand out to you, like, okay, like that was like a game changer for me?
You can always negotiate, and I think that's something that you're not taught how to do. But when I initially got into Stanford, I was super excited, and my loan burden was going to be about $250,000, and that felt suffocating. And so it was a really odd position where I felt like I had an opportunity of a lifetime that I couldn't afford. With some negotiation, we can talk more about this in person. I was able to decrease it by 80%, and so that really changed what I'm doing. And so it's crazy how much you can get if you can just ask for it. And the way that you're taught how to ask for things is really different as a first-gen low-income student than someone who comes from a more privileged background. So we can chat more.
Yeah, I would second that. I had no idea that you could ask and learned out after the fact. And it's really I just did a negotiation for my new job. Like, it's really scary to ask for more, but you all are worth it. And it's a good thing to practice doing.
I love all these. And so when we break out rooms, you can share even more specific resources and advice for those that come in your sessions. And then we'll go until about, I'd say, 8:25, 8:26. We'll pull everybody back for just a couple of minutes. I have some resources to share with everyone that I mentioned earlier, that and then some more, as well as contact information for the panelists. And so with that being said, you have your options of 4 rooms. And so they should have popped up right now.
Wait, Josh,
Yeah.
Before you press the red button and everybody goes to their separate rooms, mind if I share my screen and show the contacts for our panelists today? So, people can at least screenshot it or like pause the video in the YouTube recording later.
Go.
So this will just be for 5-10 seconds. So I'm going to share my screen, and we can, all their information is going to be on the wrap-up email after this event. Okay. Screenshots done. You may proceed.